Part 2. The Psychopath. Chapter 1. Rob was taking I-5 north. The windows were rolled down and the cool night air that was ripping into the car was shit for gas mileage, but it was helping to keep him awake. He had gotten misty-eyed a few times while he drove away from his friends, but the wind had dried the tears off his face. He had promised in his note to be back soon, but a large part of him wondered if he would ever come back at all. If he had any say in how everything turned out, he definitely would be. The suitcase was on the back seat, trembling from the poorly paved section of freeway. There were also several articles of clothing back there that Sue and Michelle had left in the car for some reason. He hoped they wouldn't miss the scattered garments while he was gone. He would do his damnedest to get it all back to them soon. His small stack of motivations was on the passenger seat beside him. The book was on the bottom. The drawing was on top of it, with the image showing, and on top of that was the apple to keep it from flying out the window. The flapping paper under the apple kept flickering the drawing in and out of view. The recollections the picture conjured up inspired him to keep going. The sun was starting to come up. Dawn was a more than welcome sight. It meant he could finally sleep. He didn't want to get a motel. He wanted to make his $967 and change last. He didn't know what kind of unforeseen expenses would come up. He had already spent $33 filling up the nearly empty gas tank. He was driving 65 miles per hour. Anything more than that in Sue's 1989 Honda Prelude would shake so badly that he feared the frame would fly apart in the middle of the freeway, or at least break down, steaming, leaving him stranded. He already had his mind set, though. No matter what kind of setbacks came along the way, he would keep going until he was finished with what he set out to do, or until he was dead. He had gotten used to driving again in no time at all. On his 17th birthday, his mother had gotten him a car. He didn't believe his eyes when she pulled in the driveway with a beat-up old red 1983 Dodge 400 convertible. His mind had immediately started searching for why she was in such a swanky car. It certainly was a step up from her run-down 1977 Chevrolet Monte Carlo that his mother had gotten from her parents when they had gotten a new Oldsmobile. Maybe she had won a bet or something. There was no way that it could have been for him, but it had. She had told him to stop doing the yard work and go for a test drive. She had ridden with him since, even though he had passed driver's ed, he had no real driving experience. The car had stalled twice before they could even make it out of the neighborhood. After that second time, it had died completely. Luckily, a lady had come along in a little white pickup truck and offered to give them a lift back to the nearby dealership, where his mother had gotten the car. Rob and his mom had squeezed in the front with the lady and thanked her profusely when she had dropped them off. The ever-grinning car salesman had assured Rob and his mother that the car must simply have been out of gas. His mom had said that was the first thing they had checked. The gauge had said the tank was 3/4 full. He then said that the gauge must be what was broken, and that he could have that fixed quickly and cheaply for them. Since his mother knew enough to know that a car did not lurch back and forth and crazily sputter out smelly black smoke from its exhaust pipe when it was simply out of gas, she had said goodbye to the salesman and walked Rob to the competing lot right across the street. The salesman's grin had not faltered, but he had told her she would not find a better car for that price. The car had been priced at $1,000. A saleswoman briefly greeted them at the next lot. She had simply told them to have a look around, and to come and get her in the office if they needed anything. They had found a gray, scraped-up 1985 Mustang hatchback at the back of the lot, covered in dirt, with a price tag on it for $900. They had gotten a saleswoman and she had given them the keys, and Rob had driven his mom all around town. She had asked him to drive to the grocery store and then the bank, and then back to their house to drop things off. He had driven cautiously and slowly, but not badly. His mother had withdrawn $300 from the ATM before they had gone to the store and the house. It had been almost an hour and a half later when they had gotten back to the car dealership. The saleswoman had come running out of her office before Rob even got the car parked. She had run up to them and asked what had taken so long. She asked if they had gotten pulled over. They had said no. She had said she had called the police and reported the car stolen. She had been clearly annoyed, but she had not been abrupt enough to ruin a possible sale. They all had gone into her office and she had called the police back to say that everything was fine. Rob and his mom had told her that the car ran great and that they would love to buy it. She was no longer annoyed then. His mom had worked out the payment plan for him by supplying all her information and claiming responsibility, but all the while she had been telling Rob that it was really his sole responsibility to take care of the payments. He had agreed. The $300 from his mom's bank account had paid for the tax, tag, and title. Rob had been left to pay for everything else. He'd had a few summer jobs in the past, but didn't really have any money to speak of. He would have to pay $200 per month for the next 6 months with the interest rate he had gotten. Sunnyvale was a small town in southeast Florida, and work was scarce, but he had been offered a full-time job at the local Wendy's. It had required him to work the daytime shift Monday through Friday. The younger kids had taken all the night and weekend shifts so they could go to school in the daytime. He had asked his mom to assist him in his withdrawal from high school. She had been surprisingly agreeable, but had made him promise to finish up his last few remaining credits and at least get his GED through night school. He had promised, and then was off to join the workforce. He had finished his scholastic requirements and had gotten his actual diploma through the mail 3 months later. He had stayed at the job for another year. The car had been completely paid off. His expensive present had been all his. He had sold the car the next year for $600 to help fund his move out to L.A. Most of it had been spent on living expenses like food and clothes before he had gotten to move out, but he had saved $500 more from Wendy's in a few more months, taking the limited local bus line to get there, and then was finally able to afford the move. He had bolted before his Florida life sucked those funds dry as well. He had missed his car from the day he had sold it 5 years before. He would sometimes have daydreams about the simple things he missed, like highway hypnosis, pumping gas, being able to get somewhere so far away. Despite the circumstances, a part of him loved the freedom of being behind the wheel again. However, he had never been less free. As a child, he had been a passenger in his own life, being driven by some pretty moronic adults. He had sworn to himself that his life would be great once he was the one able to do the steering. He had gotten in the driver's seat of his life at 18, but his life was even more horrific than ever. He felt like he'd somehow let himself down. His only choice was to do what he had to do. Right then, what he had to do was get some sleep. He was starting to hallucinate from weariness. He saw a line of empty bird cages in his lane, but since he knew he was just suffering from sleep deprivation, he drove right through the ghostly cages. He still braced for the crunch of the metal even though it never came. He needed to pull over very soon. A small green reflective road sign appeared in the distance ahead and was getting more legible as he approached it. The sign indicated that the next exit was Woods Rest Cemetery. He would be at the exit in 4 more miles. He was still traveling at 65 miles per hour on cruise control, and he tried to keep himself awake with a little math problem. If he was going 65 miles an hour and only had to go 4 more miles, then how many minutes would it be before he got there? Oh, fuck it. He couldn't even begin guessing without a calculator. By the time he was starting to give up on the numbers, he had reached the exit and turned off the freeway. An arrow told him to turn right. The word rest in the name of the graveyard was quite enticing. His dry eyes were squinting in the morning light as he pulled through the large iron gates, which luckily were open. He was able to relax his eyelids as the car moved beneath the canopy of trees and into the shade. It was a small cemetery, and Rob could tell he was alone. The road was shaped like a teardrop that led you in and around and back out again. He pulled mostly off the pavement, in case another car came along, and parked on the grass under a tree that looked like it suffered from acute arthritis. He reclined the seat until his head was below the bottom of the window and out of view. He was asleep in less than 5 minutes. The early afternoon sunlight had moved the tree shadows from lying across the road in the car to shading the graves instead. Heat waves were rising from the hood of the exposed car. Rob, dripping with sweat, began to groan and turn his head from side to side in his sleep in an effort to ward off the heat. It was futile. His eyes stung when he opened them. He lay there, too tired to move, not believing he was awake so soon after finally getting to sleep. There was no way he was going to be able to drift off again. His body would not allow him to just lie there and bake. He sat up and pulled the lever at the bottom of the seat to bring it back to the upright position, and he sat back against it. He scanned the graveyard in his dazed state. He was still alone, and the overhead scorching sun had removed all the shade from where he had parked. He would have to plow over a few headstones in order to be able to park in the shade again. He sighed and got out of the car. He stretched and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the backs of his hands. There was a very shady spot on the other side of the cemetery. With half-lidded eyes, he walked across the pavement, through the small section of grass in the middle of the teardrop, which surrounded a small shed, across the road onto the other side, and then through the short rows of graves. A family plot caught his eye. They were the only people in the lot to be sealed in above-ground concrete tombs. There were 3 graves: Belladonna Mitchell, 1893 to 1925, Saul Mitchell, 1887 to 1928, and Daniel Mitchell, 1922 to 1924. They were lined up from left to right, from largest to smallest. Belladonna must have been a big girl, Rob thought. He stared at Daniel's grave for some time. His tomb had a forked lightning bolt crack through the lid. It was giving way just slightly in the middle of the crack. There was a lamb with curled legs, engraved near the top, with its face turned outward, protruding from the slab. It was bordered with stone flowers, which had been weathered back to nubs. Daniel's grave, for some inexplicable reason, filled Rob with sadness and comfort at the same time. He sat down, Indian style, at the foot of the grave and took the whole place in. A chain-link fence that began and ended at the iron gates, which were obviously just more for show than security, surrounded it. He didn't get the feeling that the place got desecrated or vandalized often. There were only 3 houses close by, and a small neighborhood could be seen off in the hilly distance. He didn't know what the name of this small town was. He was only sleeping in it, or at least trying to. He hadn't remembered if the freeway signs had named it. The cemetery didn't even have any sign of its own name since the one on the freeway. Rob wondered where the caretaker was. The lush grass had been recently mowed. He wondered if the beautiful leafy trees' roots were growing their way through the coffins below and through the bodies. He looked back at the grave he was sitting at and said, "Wonder what your story is, little guy." He leaned back on his elbows, and at some point, without realizing it, he dozed off.